Hello, and thanks for joining us today for another iteration of Meet a Professional Series, or MAPS. My name is Matthew Garcia. I'm an Associate Director at the Career Center. I'm joined today by Amalia Clapper, who is going to be speaking to us about her field and her work and sharing some insight and guidance that we hope can be of use to anybody who is pursuant of or considering the careers in the field of education. So without further ado, Amalia, if you don't mind, could you please tell us about yourself and what influenced you to enter your field?
Sure. Hi, Abby. So I went to Stern. I studied chemistry and music. And then I went to grad school for education. I was a New York City teaching fellow, which is like a 2-year program where you jump right into the public school system and you become a teacher right away while you're in grad school. So I got a master's in the art of teaching from Relay Graduate School. And I've been teaching for about 6 years now. So in the public schools, the public school system. What influenced me to join? Actually, my own education, my own experience as a student, influenced that. I think I struggled in ways that weren't noticed as a student because I was doing well, and that was something that always confused me. So I was struggling, but I was doing well, and that as like a concept always was something that I thought about, and a goal of trying to reach students in wherever they are, whether they're struggling, whether they're not struggling. Noticing those things was something that I found really interesting. So yeah, that's sort of what influenced me to get into education.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing. What during and shortly after college influenced your short-term and long-term goals? And how much did your undergraduate degree play a role in those goals?
So um, I graduated and went straight to teaching. I didn't take any. I graduated in May and then started teaching at the end at the beginning of the next school year, in the public schools. So most of the influence was from undergrad itself, and I found that my struggles in science were influenced me to kind of be. I'm a science teacher. I teach high school chemistry and biology and physics, depending on the year, and that same issue of me learning science was a struggle. So me wanting to give back to students to help them was one thing, but not as much my undergrad degree was helpful, more my experience outside of school. So I did counterpoint Israel for 3 summers. That's like a summer program. Do they have counterpoint still at YU? Do they still do
Not that
counterpoint?
I'm particularly familiar with.
It's a summer program where you spend. They were doing it for many years, but I guess with COVID also, I don't know what's been happening. But where you run English camps for kids in development towns in Israel in the south. So I spent 3 summers and a winter. I ran a mission, and I spent one summer, half of it doing counterpoint, working with kids and teaching and doing all that, and then one half in a lab doing food science. And then it was like that summer that it sort of clicked for me, saying like working with people, teaching is like totally up my alley, and sitting in a lab with 6 other people watching a pot boil is not my speed. So that was kind of for me that was what pushed me to go into education officially.
Got it. Thank you very much. What should our audience know about the field that goes beyond what they might learn about it in their coursework?
Teaching is hard work. It's not as appreciated as it should be. Um, Students also work really hard. I think that's something that I don't know if teachers give enough credit to students. As a student, you appreciate being appreciated as well, not just being a teacher. So
Mhm.
I have notes here. It takes a lot of patience. Um, and I think something that you don't always think about is who you work for and who you work with really matters in education. There's a lot of energy and emotion that goes into your job. And if you're not supported by people, fellow teachers who are supporting you, and administration, it could be really difficult and you could burn out. So
Mhm.
having that support is huge.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit to hands-on experiences, what should our audience know about internships, fellowships, shadowing? How do they make the most of these experiences?
I'd say jumping in. Don't be afraid to teach a class and mess it up. Um, take on internships, take on experiences where you stand in front of a class and you try to get them to understand something, right? Taking those kinds of chances are really big. I think your experience comes into play when you're looking for jobs. People want to know that you've stood in front of students before and you've tried to teach them. So I wouldn't even like, teacher's assistant roles and what do they call them? What do you call them when they stand? I can't think of what they're called.
I'm trying
But
to think of it also.
taking on like a main teacher role, don't be afraid to try that,
Mhm,
basically, right? Like I ended up leaving Stern and I went straight into teaching full time. It was terrifying. It
mhm.
was really hard, but having experiences like that before you step into the real world, whatever that means,
Mhm.
is also really important.
Kind of taking a sidetrack a little bit, where would students who are looking for those experiences best locate them and pursue those and earn those opportunities?
Um, I guess it depends on the track you're in. Camps are actually a really good experience in terms of managing kids. So that's a fairly accessible way to have access to your skills and to get to know who you are when you interact with students. Um, I mean, even reaching out to shadow teachers is good. Doing a program choosing a grad program where the focus is in the classroom. So plug for Relay, where I went. They didn't pay me to say this, but it ended up being a great program for me because their focus was all about the classroom.
Mhm,
We weren't talking about education in the clouds. We were talking about education. How do you stand in front of your class to best, you know, reach them? So,
mhm.
yeah, I would say low, non, like experiential things in front of kids, like camps and stuff, or shadowing teachers you might know. People are often really happy to help as teachers, so that would be my advice.
Got it. Thank you. So you talked a little bit about shadowing as well in the question. What about volunteer experiences? How does that prepare you for work in education, generally or specifically?
Yeah, I mean, any sort of experience where you get to watch a teacher try to help students learn is great because you will see when you're in the moment teaching, you have one perspective. And when you're watching the students from the outside and you're watching how the teacher is interacting, you can come up with a list of things that, wow, that's the way that teacher interacted with that student. They got it. The student got it. How did they do that? And asking yourself questions like that are really big. So watching people teach, and then if you were watching me, I would want you to give me feedback because I don't see everything in the classroom, and you might see something that I'm not seeing as an outsider looking in. So being curious, why is something working? Why is something not working? How do you know if students are engaged? Thinking about those things when you're in a volunteer position um, is huge, is really big.
So in those experiences, I would imagine you're picking up on some skills that are required. You mentioned where you're standing in front of the room and how you're instructing. So what are some technical and soft skills that are necessary that students who are pursuing the pursuit of this career path should be considering, should be working on while they're in college and shortly after?
Yeah, especially for teaching, you want to think about question sequencing. What questions are you asking students to get from point A to point B so that you're not giving them the answer straight out? You want to think about um, checking for understanding. They call it CFU, check for understanding. How do you know that a student knows something? Just because you said it doesn't mean they know it, doesn't mean they understand it. How do you make sure that students are engaged to getting to putting the information into their own heads? You can't pour it in, they've got to put it there. So what engaging activities, what engaging questions, and how are you checking at the end of a class or throughout the class that students are with you. So I think that's a skill, more of a hard skill that comes with time. It comes with repeating curricula. It comes with creating new curricula. Um, but it's definitely really important.
Awesome. Kind of taking the route of professional development in a way and making connections. How does one effectively network in the field of education, and what does it take to form lasting connections with professionals?
Well, like I said before, who you work with and who you work for are big deals. If you find good people, I've worked in a number of schools at this point, and I'm still connected with the teachers that I've worked with. Networking is not the same in education as it is in other fields. I think that's because of the nature of the job. It's so focused on the type of student, who you're working with, and it's sometimes pretty insular. Depending on where you work, there might be networks of schools that come together where you can share ideas and information. But what I find is that people are usually really happy to help and to give in the education field. So if this is like, if you wanted to speak to somebody who is an English teacher, I could connect you with an English teacher. I don't teach English, but I could connect you with somebody who would be happy to give you insights, thoughts, materials, whatever it is. So I think in terms of networking, I think a lot about not reinventing the wheel, not being afraid to ask, because a lot has been done that's been great in education. A lot exists. You don't need to create everything from scratch. So using the network of teachers out there is really important, and not being afraid to reach out. It's not the same though as like, you're not going to go to a networking party where you meet new people and then email them later being like, so nice to meet you. It's not the same as that, but everyone's really friendly. And if I wanted to reach out to a colleague I worked with 5-6 years ago who I haven't spoken to, I would feel comfortable doing that, because the work you do is so intimate when you're doing the work that it's one of those connections that don't break even if you don't continue to feed them. So that's what I'd say about networking.
Very good to know. Thank you. Kind of related, how does that compare to trying to find a mentor in a network that you're trying to access or a network that you're a part of? And how important is it to have mentorship?
Mentorship is really important. That's something else I would look for in a school when you're looking for people you work for, that they're looking to help you grow. I've been teaching for 6 years. I will be growing as a teacher for the next 30 years, I hope. I'm a teacher for my career. I chose to do this, and I am not looking to be a principal. I'm looking to stay in the classroom right now. And having people who are ahead of you that you can look up to and ask questions, they just have more experience than you. So it's really helpful to have connections of people who've been doing it longer. It just sort of cuts some of the learning curve for you. A lot of it is individual though, right? Like, you in your classroom, your personal experience will help you grow, sometimes more than anybody else's comments. But definitely mentors, they can cut the time, give you ideas. And you're like, oh my gosh, why didn't I do this why haven't I been doing this for the past 6 years? They give you these like amazing ideas of things they've been doing. So mentors are huge. And if you're not looking to grow in education, the kids don't need that. Like, students don't need that. Students don't need people who think that they're right all the time. They know how to do things. Like, they need people who are confident that learning is ongoing, and that can admit that they're not right, and can teach you how to find the answers if you get stuck. So if you're somebody who's not going to look for a mentor or look for growing opportunities, I would think twice about being a teacher. It's not a rote career. It's not, you can't just hit play. There's always something to think about and to grow. So.
Thanks very much for those insights. Really appreciate it. Last question for me before we open up the floor for conversation. In general, where do you see the field headed in the next 5 years? And how will you be adjusting to these developments and changes?
Mm, this is a great question because you know how I was saying that you shouldn't reinvent the wheel, which I still think is true. But there's something that kind of worked out about COVID in that if it had been 5 months of us being on, I'm 100% remote right now. I have not been in school all year, which is crazy. But with remote learning being as long as it has been, we've been able to solidify the technological advances in education. Had it been 5 months, we sort of would have reverted back to the same way that we do things, and we wouldn't have necessarily gained the benefit of all the technological advances that could have happened. But because we've had so much time where we've needed to be online, we've needed to reach students from a distance, we've been able to successfully create new pathways to educate different types of students and see students differently. So I think in the next 5 years, please God, we will be back in the building with students. But I also hope that I will be taking many of the technological advances that I've made and the creative juices that I had to kind of use to create what I'm doing now with my students, putting that into the classroom once we're in person is going to be really cool. I think there's going to be a lot of advances in that regard in education, and it's good. So yeah.
That is incredible. Thank you. Thank you very much. So that's it for my questions. But we would love to get questions from our audience. So if you'd like, you can talk directly to Amalia and ask any questions you might have. You may also put them in the chat if you feel more comfortable.
I'm glad you're showing your face, Abby. My students don't even show their faces. Just talk to a computer all day. It's very stressful. Not stressful, it's more just like lonely.
I do have one follow-up question, actually, to one of the questions that we were talking about. So you had mentioned that volunteer experiences, especially in camps, are great to learn from. Do you have any specific experiences or stories that you can talk about that transferred to your work currently?
Yeah. An addendum to the camp thing, leadership roles in camp is also really good. It gives you a sense of all the moving parts in a classroom, so that's helpful. In terms of my own experiences, totally. Right now I'm teaching in a public school where the population is all recent immigrants to the country from all over the world, and they don't speak English as a first language, and I'm teaching science, and some of them have interrupted learning, interrupted education. Some of them did 2 years of high school in their countries but have to restart. And actually my experience in Counterpoint was huge because I was teaching English to students who didn't speak English. Granted, I speak Hebrew, so that was helpful to communicate with them, but that directly helped me in my job of just understanding what it feels like to be lost in a language and not understand what people are saying. And the feeling of my year in Israel, when I spent a year in Israel after high school, learning the Hebrew language, it's so stressful. You have all of these thoughts in your head and you cannot say them. And that moment where someone laughs at a joke you say and you're like, oh, you can be funny in a different language, you've made it. So I think understanding the personal experience of our students from a language perspective, not life experience. They've gone through a lot of things in their lives, a lot of my students. But from that language perspective and having experience working in camp with kids who also are struggling for a number of reasons and don't have the language, So a lot of that did come into play in my teaching. In my teaching.
Gotcha. Thank you. I appreciate it. So actually, what I want to do is, what I'll do is I'll cut the recording here. Just do a brief wrap just for the recording, and then we'll have a separate dialogue Q&A that we can have thereafter. So just to wrap, um, again, appreciate you coming and making the time. This was a wonderful conversation, and we'll shift gears to Q&A.
Thank you for having me.